Hello, everyone, and welcome to an adventure podcast, a podcast where we talk about the wide world of visual novels. I'm your host, Taros113, along with my co-host, MR, and this week's episode will be about the mystery genre. There's all sorts of mysteries involved in visual novels. VNDB.org defines a mystery as a mystery is a story whose plot involves a crime or other event that remains puzzlingly unsettled until the very end. There's plenty of stories that have a puzzle remaining until the very end. Some are heavier on it than others. For example, Umineko, which unfortunately we haven't read yet. I wish I could talk about that one, but oh well. MR is going to start things off about one of his titles that he really enjoyed.
Yeah, and before that, I just want to relate to the definition you cited from the VNDB, because for me, a very important part what makes a mystery good is it solvable? And what I mean by that is there enough hints and foreshadowing for a person who analyzes stories and analyzes dialogue, or maybe even scenes and images, to come to their own hypothesis that is either close enough or in the same vein as a general direction of the mystery itself. So what I mean by that, if the twists and reveals are out of left field and you had absolutely no chance of guessing that to me signals a bad story, or rather a bad mystery, because your chances of solving it are near zero. But on the other hand, if it's too easy to solve and the twist too obvious, that also is pretty lackluster. And the best middle ground is if they have a good enough hints, yet they distract you in some way or guide you to the wrong conclusion. I think the most famous example would be Fate, and how they used a main character servant, and there is a certain direction they wanted a player to guess the identity of, which wasn't the one to be revealed. And I really like how that aspect ties into the mystery element. So again, they introduce a character that it's very important to know her identity. A lot of clues lead you in one direction, and majority of people say that would be their guess, and I specifically avoid talking about specific just in case a viewer of ours didn't read Fate, but the conclusion is actually not that character but other. So yep. I like how that works.
When you have a work that involves secret identities like Fate does, but there's still famous figures throughout history, it's like, oh, that's when you can play the guessing game. You can think about how they're acting and their famous weapons and whatnot. You can take stabs throughout history and figure out who they are. Some are more obvious than others, of course, but still, that's the fun in a mystery, trying to figure out the answer before the story tells you.
Yeah, and just before I go to my example, I wanted to say I take into consideration all the aspects in the story when it's told, and I try to come up with my hypothesis. Probably my biggest guess would be in one of the titles I've played. I guessed character's identity by its posture. And that's it. That was enough for my theory, and it proven true, because the posture of that character lined exactly with what I had in mind for it. That was probably the craziest I guessed and the earliest I guessed the identity. Because those specifics I focused on were so in line and with all my theories. So I'm specifically vague, both on title and the identities, not to spoil for anybody. And this probably is very difficult to attain in a episode dedicated to mysteries, not to spoil them. So on that note, let me start things off with Nanairo Reincarnation, because that's the most, how can I say, MR's mystery I know, and this is the first mystery that comes to mind that is in lieu and in line with the normal definition, meaning the one that is provided by VNDB. This is a story of a murder case, and unlike regular murder mystery that uses detective, in this story you are a psychic detective, so with a bit of a supernatural element thrown in. You utilize it's not necessarily demons as we know it in the West, but rather it's more akin to yokais from Japanese folklore, with the main how can I say, manager of your detective party being Zashiki Wakashi. Oh my god, I think I butchered that name. That's the spirit that cannot leave the mansion, and it's a trickster of sorts. Whereas the other demons you have in your posse are the more akin to, how can I describe it the best? Their powers relate to talking with objects or memories of places. And that's a very interesting approach to that. You are a detective that touches objects to know its history and then pieces together what happened due to the images you received in your brain.
So when you mentioned that the psychic detective abilities, it's the sort where main character can touch things and get flashbacks of things that happened in the past involving those objects or memories?
Yes.
Okay, and so then you have to figure out the context of these scenes and how it tied into this, murder case, right?
Yes, exactly. I don't want to give all the details in case someone really wants to read the story. I just want to correct one thing: is you as a detective are the regular human. You have no powers, but you are part of a team of people who have different powers. They specialize in different psychic manipulation, and you channel through yourself their powers. So yes, the protag will see the memories in his head, but he's not the one making the reads. He is just a conduit for it.
Okay.
Something
and I'm
like
assuming some of these scenes are misleading and you don't realize it until later, right?
Exactly.
That's exactly how a mystery should be.
Yeah, exactly. So it passes my my test of is it a good mystery? It gives you enough hints to formulate a thesis, but it has so many different applications. You can go in so many different directions. It's not easy to guess spot on what's the mystery here. And one thing that is very interesting in how Nanairo does things, it is a multi-ending game with several capturable characters. And despite that, regardless of which ending you go through, the mystery will be solved. They might get some small tidbits and details left over, so you haven't discovered those specifics, but the main mystery case, the main murder mystery, will get solved regardless of which ending you go for.
Wow, so there's a whole bunch of different ways you can wind up solving the mystery? It's I guess you could say a whole bunch of different approaches you could take.
Exactly, yeah. I don't want to give out too much.
Okay.
But basically, it all correlates to the same point. But the way you get to that point can be from different angles. And after that, and after the solving of mystery, you fork back to the different endings. So you have a one bottleneck event that all the points will correlate to that point. And after that point, it will always split off to different endings. But because of that specific structure, the main mystery will be solved. So this is interesting, especially for those people, and I know there are quite a few readers who like to read their own favorite route instead of fully reading a VN. This is a mystery that works for those specific people who have either time or they just like reading one route. Because the main mystery will be solved. You do not need 100% completeness to understand what was going on.
But all the other decisions and choices are if you want to see the different angles or maybe check out all the content in the VN?
Exactly.
Okay, you know what? I actually really like that approach. Because it's, on the one hand, it's a linear story, so you know the developers put a lot of thought into the beginning and the ending and how everything ties together. But at the same time, you're also giving the players choices, right? So where you can decide how you want to approach it, or if you're noticing something that perhaps some other reader wouldn't have caught. So you can kind of feel like the detective yourself, right?
Exactly.
That sounds really fun.
Yeah, this is quite a newer release. And in my opinion, is very beautiful when it comes to CG and its quality. So for me, who is used to reading visual novels on 720p or even lower,
oh my goodness,
having a 1080 plus quality out of the gate natively is just amazing, especially since one of the most distinctive features, and it's very hard to capture, screenshot and showcase in the images that run in the background, is their special effect. So how can I best describe it? During the scenes when the psychic powers are used, you have appropriate sound effects, so for example buzzing noises, and special effects on CG that try to, as best as possible, give you a glimpse of how that style of psychic powers would look and feel. And I think they achieve a really great marks on that.
Nice. You mentioned the high definition art and cool special effects and stuff. You happen to remind me of a VN I read that I really enjoy. 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. And it was originally released on the Nintendo DS, a handheld video game system. It had 2 screens and they were like 4 inches by 3 inches. There was very little real estate to work with there.
Okay.
But I still really enjoyed it. It's definitely one of my favorite titles. It's one of the first that got me into the wide world of visual novels. As for its mystery, 9 strangers get kidnapped, thrown together onto a sinking ship, and they're told that they have to navigate some dangerous life and death puzzles set up by their sadistic host to escape. And as they're exploring, they realize that there are things going on much grander than they could have imagined at the start. And of course, there's questions, and you get some answers, and there's more questions off of that. And so it very much fits the whole mystery thing of who the host is and why they're doing this. You also mentioned earlier with, Nanairo Reincarnation, how it had different routes to get to the ending. 999 has choices of, the same thing, of which rooms you want to explore, who you want to partner up with. But depending on the choices you get, you might find yourselves in a bad ending, where you've taken the wrong steps and then the story ends with the protagonist dying. And part of it is fun because it's the gameplay, because, hey, you're making choices and you're sweating it out. Like, oh my god, is this the right choice? Is this the wrong choice? True. But the other part of it is that you get little scraps of information from these bad ends. You realize, obviously you don't realize anything too groundbreaking because, you die and it's a bad end. It's intended to be you failed. But you do find out scraps of info of what's going on behind the scenes and who's looking real suspicious. And they all tie together into their true ending. Where you can't get the true ending the first time you play the game. You have to go through these side routes, like you mentioned. Some people don't like it, like you mentioned with Nanairo Reincarnation, where someone could just do one route of how they do it and call it a day. 999 is instead different, where you have to explore all the options to get the full story and to piece together the truth of what's going on.
So I have 2 points to raise with what you described. One pertains to what you described when it comes to... Okay, now I'm spacing out. You know what? I'll start with the other part. So the true ending. So you say you cannot achieve true ending. So this is interesting because you make it so you need to piece together all the information in the visual novel before you get the true answer, which is fine. This is the normal approach. To me, it's always harkens back to the Sengoku runs and their approach, how you cannot achieve any other ending than true at the start. So this is the complete reversal. That's always something that just makes me laugh of how they subvert that idea. And fair enough, there's are different approaches to that. With Sengoku Ran's approach is more akin to you need to know how this story ends before you get what ifs as their approach. And your approach is, not your, but 999's approach is you need to piece together all the bits and pieces before you get the final answer.
And that's right. I definitely appreciated it because it gave more stakes to the final ending, you know?
Fair enough. And what I wanted to add with the second point is this is very similar to how Fate does it. You treat choices as kind of a puzzle of correct and not correct. And even in not correct choices, you get a small tidbits of information. Just a very, very, very minor spoiler. In a Fate, you can get a glimpse of a caster servant way before that character is introduced by following a bad ending. So that's interesting. So you got an insight on a character that has not been introduced just because you picked bad choices.
That's right. And I know that's a little Easter egg some DNs like to put in when they have tons of bad ends, something to keep them exciting. True. In 999's case, it's definitely intended as part of the whole experience. Heck, its sequel, Virtue's Last Reward, goes even more overboard with that. Virtue's Last Reward is a similar deal where 9 strangers get kidnapped and thrown together into an underground facility. And they have to work together and judge how much they're willing to trust each other to escape.
Okay.
This one has many more choices because of how often the main character needs to decide to be trusting of others or not. And in fact, there are many branches along the way, based on the choices you make, where you might find yourself stumped with an impossible hurdle in front of you, where there's a problem going on that the main character simply can't solve. Okay. And the knowledge of how to solve this problem, you need to carry over from, your own knowledge from a different route. So in fact, you're locked off and the story simply can't continue until you can find your solution somewhere else in an, I guess you could say, alternate universe of choices you've made. The VN relies pretty heavily on that mechanic. And so even though you have a title that has tons of choices and gives a lot of whole branching outcomes and different story content, it's still somewhat intended as a linear story. It's specifically set up to where you'll need to find certain story beats before you can continue other story branches, and then those are locked behind further story branches. So even though you have all this freedom of choice, sometimes you're still blocked off.
Yeah, because the way you describe that title, it seems to me like there was a linear story from start to finish that got chopped off into segments. Then those segments became branches And some of the branches require other branches, which kind of emulates a linear story. And your puzzle within those branches and choices is to reconstruct the linear story that was from the very origin.
Yes. I know that's definitely a lot of fun in piecing together the mystery. Again, there's so many questions that arise as you keep getting answers, and they just lead to more questions. And I always love that whenever mystery stories have solid pacings where they actually give you breadcrumbs along the way. It's always miserable whenever you just keep getting dumped with more questions and questions and questions. And yeah, exactly. You can't follow anything. So I do always like a mystery story with good pacing, you know?
Yeah, this is probably my biggest issue when it comes to BlazBlue series. They are a slow burner all the time, and oftentimes when you get a payoff and you get an explanation of question you had, those explanations often leave you with more questions. And if you have low tolerance for that, then BlazBlue is not the story for you. Sorry.
Yep, I know that.
So again, good pacing really helps. Maybe my first exposure to titles such as, like I mentioned, BlazBlue make me more, how can I say, and having more endurance towards those who have worse pacing, as long as they have a good payoff. I'll still be angry if the title is long but unsatisfying with crappy payoff. But I completely feel you when you speak about those exhausting points you need to find from other points of branches to proceed with the branch you got locked off of.
Yeah, definitely some people have complained about that, how they're enjoying this plot and think, events are escalating, and then suddenly they just get slammed into a wall. And you're like, okay, you're done here, go somewhere else now. They've complained about that, and I totally understand where they're coming from. I still enjoyed it, especially because there aren't many, VN titles that experience a story like that, with just constant branching paths and you hop around everywhere from one point to another. And I really like how non-linear it was, You don't see that often.
That's true on that point of non-linearity, but even before that, I have a cut-off point, because you mentioned that as a negative, and I felt this was a very unique, maybe unique is the wrong word, but very stimulating in case of Euphoria. They have one ending that just ends abruptly without any explanation, and in order to proceed with that, you need to fulfill other conditions. And it's done in such an intriguing way, it's very hard to describe, because they flip the atmosphere so hard, you are very confused. You are so motivated to figure out why the hell happened, because just for the context, you are entering the most mad route, meaning mad, a shortcut for mutually assured destruction, in psychological warfare that ends in such an abrupt way that flips your expectation, and then you go to the title screen like nothing happens. And that motivates you so much harder to figure out what the hell happened. So that's one of the unique ways I experienced the cutoff point. But I definitely feel your argument that when people enjoy a story, then that's cut off at some point. I'm like, can you continue because that was cool? And the game is like, no.
Yep.
And on the other point, so the multiple routes and branches, I want to go to the second example I prepare for my mystery segment, is the Trample of Schatten. This is a curious case because it's not easy to pinpoint where's the mystery. But that's the funny part of this game. There is no overarching murder case to be solved, but rather, maybe it worked for me, okay? I had a very early hook. You get introduced in similar vein to Fate, You have an intro that is from different perspective of events than the main game, but it ends on a very well-placed bit of music that starts up with a keychain singing. It says, "Get up, start your story," and then the game starts going crazy. And it's an action-paced title without any gameplay. It's just a lot of action scenes with characters in that VN. And again, like I said, why the hell a keychain starts the entire story? I wrote it down in my notes for that game. I stuck that with a sticker on my monitor, and I held that for the entire duration of me reading that title. I just needed to know what the heck started it all off. And obviously they introduced different mysteries. There's some mysteries of identities, because when dealing with superheroes, because the kind of the theme they're going with, superpowered characters, the obfuscation of identity is a sub-theme of that. So figuring out who's who is obviously a mystery in it of itself. And unlike Nanairo Reincarnation, this game, if you reach an ending, cuts off. So you will not solve the central mystery.
What do you mean by cut off? Like, if you take certain wrong choices, you hit a bad ending?
No. If you make certain choices, you'll reach an ending, which might be a bad ending. I don't remember if that game has it, though. Maybe it doesn't. You'll reach an ending. So, for example, let's say this game has 4 pursuable characters, with one of them being the main girl, let's call it. And if you pursue her, you'll reach a true ending. But if you pursue someone else, due to your choices, you'll abruptly end the story with those characters and with conclusion of that. But the main mystery will not be solved. And again, I'm specifically vague what's the main mystery here, because it will shift and change during the course of the game. You will be thrown into the events not knowing what's what, and piecing it all together is part of the charm, especially given that, as I jumped into this title promising a flowchart, yes, not only does it have a flowchart, but it has flowchart from 1, different perspective of characters, 2, differently placed achronological events, and thirdly, you, as a part of the UI, all the time you have a button to jump between the stories and continue from those points, not only as a means of recollection, so like a save slot, load slot, but rather you are required to do so to progress, because some of the stories, some of the events are not connected. And why are they not connected is also a part of the mystery. Why do you have gaps in between those events and only different characters exist?
So you'll wind up seeing several characters and their point of views in scenes that are taking place out of chronological order, right? So you'll see someone's point of view and you'll wonder, what event is this? And, when does it take place? And how does it affect their outlook on things, right?
Yeah. And you are always provided with the time frame and date, but you are not necessarily easy to point out where and how those two relate. You always have a time frame, you always have chronological date, time, etc. But it's so much harder to picture it all together. How do those interlocking events work together?
Because that's what happens in a mystery. There's a whole bunch of puzzle pieces lying on the floor, and it's up to you to figure out how they all connect, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong on that, unlike Virtual Last Reward and 999, Trample on Schatten uses a singular timeline, meaning there is no parallel universes. I mean, you can consider endings a parallel story, but everything outside of endings all happens in the true route.
Okay, so very much so a linear story.
Yes. And the one that you need to experience fully, well, although probably you get the full mystery in only true end. So for those people who read only one ending, I recommend reading the true ending. And
Makes sense.
the rest are not required to know. But if you happen to end on those, you will not solve it. Or at least you will not get the explanation. So that was my experience with that kind of flowcharty system. And similar to how Nanairo has a very unique and interesting animation, Trample of Schatten uses shadows as an animation. It is very, very hard to describe it, but they do it in a very unique way. It's unfortunate that for today's episode I have two titles for which its presentation is very hard to show on screenshots. Hopefully for those people who want to try them, you'll see what I'm talking about, because they are using hand-drawn animation on top of CGs to emulate shadows enveloping characters. And that's a very unique animation style I really like.
Like there's a character, a silhouette standing there, but with a very fuzzy outline. That sort of thing?
You think about shadow as something behind. I'm thinking about shadows as something that envelops you completely.
Yeah, like a silhouette.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, you can say, you can say that silhouette, because I related silhouette as something behind. No, it's something on a foreground, on top of you. But yeah.
Interesting. Okay. There's one other title I want to talk about before we wrap up today. Specifically...
Go for it.
Yes, your talk about timelines and whatnot reminded me about Raging Loop.
Okay.
There we go. Raging Loop is a story. It's actually a time loop where one normal guy is riding his motorbike, winds up getting lost, pulls up into a rural village, and there are some strange ritual shenanigans going on, where apparently some of them have been infected as werewolves. And it's the villagers' job to try and put everyone on trial every single day and try to suss out who is a werewolf each day. And at night, the werewolves go wild and kill some of them. However, main character's stuck in a time loop. And so as he's trying to figure out the victims and how to prevent any more deaths, he's also trying to figure out the truth behind what's going on in this crazy ritual with the werewolves in this rural village. And it's built up as being a mystery title with a whole lot of strange things going on and more questions piling on. But to be honest, I really hated this VN.
Oh.
It had like all the parts I liked. It had like the flowchart, and it had choices where you might hit bad endings. It even had time looping where you learn a little bit more and more. And the main character was even proactive. He was, pretty smart and took a stand against a lot of bad things that happened. Unfortunately, this story just went hard on the rural folklore and mysticism. I'm not really fans of those themes to begin with. And then it got to the ending, and it completely started dumping all sorts of new information on you right at the end.
I see.
And it started throwing entire character relationships into whack, and all sorts of background details suddenly came to light that have been really important the whole time that we've never heard about. It's just suddenly all the mysteries were coming out of left field, and they were getting solved in more ridiculous and confusing ways. And at that point, I just lost interest in it, I think.
What would you say was more disappointing? Was it the pacing, the way they revealed the twist, or the topic, that being the rural folklore?
Part of it was the topic. I mean, like I mentioned, I don't particularly care for VNs that are just drenched in old Japanese folklore kind of style. But I mean, that's fine. I can bear with it, especially the pacing and the mysteries are great. But in this case, the pacing was abysmal. It was like it was doing fine for itself for about 75% of it, and the last quarter just went nuts. It's one of those things where if a story starts telling you all this stuff is important, but it doesn't actually prove to you why any of it's important, then is it? Of course not. It's like, why should I bother remembering this stuff when it has no effect on the story and I have no reason to see it coming and it just makes no sense? It's like, no, I don't care about it, so I'm not going to care about the story either. That's just how it goes.
Yeah, it's disappointing when the story tries so hard to convince you of one thing, but everything in the story just contradicts it. And the example I know is there's plenty of games, titles, movies even, that try so hard on narrative level to convince you as a viewer, yes, this villain is very evil, is very dangerous, you should be afraid. But during the course of story, the villain never wins.
Yep, exactly.
Right? So how can you treat that with the level of respect and awe and fear even, if the depiction is so laughably inconsistent?
Well, Raging Loop gets credit on that one aspect. Like I said, it has werewolves, and they are truly forces of nature. Because it's a time loop system, these werewolves will frequently kill people off, and everyone will meet grisly ends. But, the main character dies, and he finds himself right at the beginning. Everyone's alive and well, and it's another try to fix things.
I see. And on that note, I think we reached the point of finality for this episode, with all those examples provided. I would like to thank all of our viewers for listening in, and for everybody who gave us their feedbacks. We really appreciate, and we try to address all the issues on the podcast. And with those words, thank you very much for listening. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.